While it's important to understand the concepts behind the motherboard, the processor, and memory, the good news is that all that electronics and circuitry stuff is carefully and safely tucked inside the box, and we're fortunate because normally we don't have to deal with it. What we usually have to deal with are all the lights and ports and buttons and things that we see on the computer itself. So let's take a few minutes to get familiar with what types of things we might see. The CPU, or computer case, will actually have many different lights, buttons, or ports that you can use. Typically, a laptop is actually going to have more than maybe a regular desktop CPU. You're going to have something like the power button. You always have to have one of those. You'll probably have a light that represents your hard drive. You'll have a battery light for your laptop. You might have multimedia buttons. And you're also going to have various different kinds of ports. Now, when we talk about the hard drive light, this is simply going to be a light somewhere on the case or on the CPU. The most important thing to recognize about this is when that light is lit, it means that the hard drive is running. In other words, it's spinning and it's actively doing something. It's really important that you do not turn off your computer while the hard drive light is spinning. That can simply cause some damage. So it's an important thing to look for if you're ever having to do what we call an emergency shutdown of your computer. We'll talk more about exactly what that process is later. But let's take a little bit of time to talk about these other options. When we talk about the power button itself, there's kind of a universal symbol, and you can see that represented here. One is actually just a symbol, but the other three are actual buttons off of computers. So they may be different colors, they may be lit up, they may be different shapes, but somewhere on your computer there's going to be a power button that you will use to power up and sometimes to also power down. The power button is a basic component, but so are the ports, which is how you actually connect things to your computer. The things that you connect to your computer, to the CPU or to the box, are called external devices or sometimes called peripheral devices. There are many types of peripherals, and there are many types of ports to go along with those. Some of the ports are specific to certain types of devices, and others are more generic and connect different types of devices to the same port. Remember that when you're connecting things to a computer, there is often a right side up for a connection. They can't just go in any old way. And maybe most importantly is never force a connection. If you try to force a cable into a port, you can damage both the port and the device cable. There are several types of ports, and this can be very confusing to people, so we want to go over some of the basics. There are actually many more types of ports than this. Some of them, though, are older, and you don't see them very often, so I didn't want to confuse you with things you probably won't see. Some of them are also very specific. What we're covering here are the ports that will be important for you as a new computer user. They include a monitor port, a keyboard and mouse port, a printer port, a port for speakers and microphones, something called firewire, and something called USB. A monitor port is fairly small, almost rectangular, and it can have little holes in it. Now again, we're not going to get into the specifics about what all of these different things are called, but here's an example of a monitor port. Make sure that when you connect a monitor cable that it's right side up, because if you look at the little holes, you see that they are not consistent, and there definitely is a right side up and down. You'll also see that there are little holes on either side into which you can screw in the monitor cable so it doesn't come loose or disconnected, causing your monitor to black out on you. These are examples of keyboard and mouse ports. Keyboard on the left, mouse on the right. They look very similar, but again, they are slightly different. And if you ever plug your keyboard into the mouse port, you'll know because they just don't work right. Again, you will see that there definitely is an up and a down. Even though these look like they are round cable connectors, there is a top side. It's easy sometimes to just simply rotate it around until you can feel that it kind of gets ready where you can push it into place. We're seeing fewer and fewer printer ports, but it can be a larger port than the monitor port, with more pins, as they say, or more holes. And again, it should be labeled, like many of these ports will be, that it is for a printer. These days with multimedia, wanting to use speakers and or microphones is important. These are very typical audio-video kinds of connections that you probably have on your portable CD player and other things that you've used. And the port itself can actually be on the back of the computer, where a sound or video card may go, or it could also be on the front of your computer. There may be several different ports that all fit the same type of thing. Usually they're marked separately for the speaker and the microphone. So make sure that you put it into the correct one. It's not that it will necessarily damage anything, it just won't work. So if you plug in your microphone and you find that you can't use it, or you plug in speakers and you can't hear anything, try another port. Firewire is a high-speed connection used for things like audio and video especially, and it's kind of a specialized type of port. Not all computers have them. Usually it needs to be higher end or set up specifically to do multimedia, audio, or video. In some ways, though, I have saved the best for last, because USB, which is a universal serial port, is actually the most popular type of port these days. It hasn't been around very long. The current standard is called USB 2 as opposed to USB 1. USB 2 is faster. So if you can buy USB 2 devices, that's the better choice. There are two different types of connectors that you can see here. One is for kind of internal devices and the other is for more portable devices called USB-A and USB-B. But the important thing is that the USB port has actually replaced many of these other ports. We aren't seeing as many monitor ports, keyboard and mouse ports, or printer ports as we used to, because those devices actually can all use a USB port. If you go down to the office supply store and you buy a printer these days, it probably will have a USB connection. When you go to buy a new computer, you actually will probably not see a printer port. Only older computers have them. So as I said earlier, don't panic if your computer doesn't have all of these ports. Probably what you'll start to see is more USB. Not that long ago, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, we only had 1 or 2 USB ports on a computer. The ones that you see nowadays have usually 2 or 4 on the front and maybe another 6 or 8 on the back. So USB ports really are becoming very popular. That's why I like to say it's becoming a USB world. Most computers today have multiple USB ports, both on the front and the back of the CPU. Many of the old proprietary ports have been replaced by these USB ports. As I said, printers, keyboards, mice, storage like external hard drives, and many other devices now come with USB connections instead of the old proprietary ones. And even though we're not going to talk specifically about it in this course, also remember that many devices are now becoming wireless. And when it's wireless, you may or may not actually need to connect it at all. Some things like Bluetooth may be built into things like your laptop, so there's nothing that you're actually going to see. It just happens to work. Others, though, will be wireless, like a wireless printer, but you may still need to put some type of a receiver into your CPU, into the USB port. The important thing to remember is that whether it's a cable or through some type of airwave, you need to have some type of connection between hardware and your CPU or your computer. If it's going to be wireless, there needs to be some mechanism for that connection to happen. So how do you find what you're looking for? Well, every computer is going to have buttons, lights, and ports, and they're all going to be in a different location. Most desktops have front and back ports only, so you can kind of limit it to at least 2 of the 4 or 6 sides, if you will. Laptops, of course, can be a little more tricky. They can have any of the 4 sides, or above the keyboard when the lid or the monitor is open. So sometimes on laptops you kind of have to search around, everywhere probably except on the bottom. Sometimes your ports and cables can be color-coded. So when you're trying to figure out which one is the mouse and which one is the keyboard port, it may be that one of the cables has a purple end on it, and so does the port. That sure makes it easy. Most are also labeled with some type of an icon. Now, if you're like me, you have to turn on a light and get pretty close to be able to see them, but you often will have a little keyboard, a mouse, a speaker, a microphone, a monitor, a printer. Those types of kind of generic universal icons may be printed somewhere on the case that will help you determine which port it is that you're looking for. And last but not least, you can always refer to your quick start guide or the user's manual that came with your computer. It should have several diagrams that will identify all of the buttons, lights, and ports that are available for your particular system.